Hey everyone and welcome to ENGLO Podcast. By the end of this short but very rich podcast you're gonna learn so many words and new idioms, let alone some golden tips and tricks and ways of learning English that will make English feel like a piece of cake. If you're new here, I'm Mike, and this is ENGLO Podcast, the #1 English podcast, the place where we break down English learning into simple, easy-to-follow steps. Whether you're just starting out or looking to brush up on your skills and learn about the language, or let me say you want to conquer the English language, rest assured because we've got you covered. During the video we'll be diving into a topic that's super important, learning English the easy way. I know it can feel overwhelming at times, but trust me, with the right approach, it doesn't have to be, so stick to the end of this video and you are going to learn a lot about English, and by the end of this video, I believe you will learn so many words and new idioms and generally you will listen to the way American people speak. So bring your attention, and welcome with me today our guest Sarah.
Hey, Mike. That was a great opening. Well, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me today. I came here so excited to chat about something I think a lot of people care about, learning English in an easy way.
Yeah, it's a big topic. So many people want to learn English, but it can be hard if you don't know where to start. I remember when I was teaching a friend who had just moved to the US from Brazil. He was so lost at first, didn't know where to begin. It was really overwhelming for him.
Oh wow, that must have been tough for him. What did you do to help?
Well, I started by showing him some really basic stuff, like how to ask for things in a store or how to introduce himself. But what really helped him was when we started watching American TV shows together. He wasn't understanding much at first, but we'd pause and go over certain phrases or words. I could see his confidence grow as he started recognizing things on his own.
That's such a great approach. It's like learning by doing, immersing yourself in the language as much as possible. I remember when I started learning Spanish in high school, I felt completely overwhelmed at first, just like your friend. I was so scared of making mistakes, especially in front of my classmates.
Oh, I totally get that. There's this fear of looking silly, right? But honestly, making mistakes is one of the best ways to learn. You just have to push through that fear.
Exactly. I had this one teacher who really encouraged us to just speak, even if we didn't know all the words. She'd say, "It's better to try and be wrong than to stay quiet and never learn." I think that really stuck with me.
That's such good advice, it hits deep. I had a similar experience while I was learning French. I was studying abroad in Canada, and I was terrified of speaking French because I didn't want to sound dumb. But one day, I just decided to go for it. I walked into a cafe and ordered my coffee in French, and yeah, I stumbled a bit, but the barista was so patient with me. It actually turned into a conversation about where I was from and why I was learning French.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to find a learning method that suits your lifestyle. For me, I loved listening to Spanish music. I'd listen to songs on repeat and try to sing along. At first, I was just mimicking the sounds, but then I started understanding the lyrics. It was such a fun way to learn, and it didn't feel like studying at all.
Music is such a powerful tool for learning. It's funny, I remember when I was a kid, my parents would play these old English songs, and I'd sing along without even knowing what the words meant. But years later, when I started learning English seriously, those songs came back to me, and I realized I had picked up so much vocabulary without even trying.
That's so cool. Music really does have a way of sticking with you. And it's not just about the words. You get a feel for the rhythm and flow of the language, too.
Exactly. It's like learning the language on a deeper level. And speaking of rhythm, another thing that helped my Brazilian friend was practicing English with short, everyday conversations. Like, we'd walk around the neighborhood, and he'd practice asking for directions or talking about the weather. Those little interactions added up over time.
That's a great idea. It's like you're learning in a natural setting where you'd actually use the language. I used to do something similar with Spanish. I'd go to the local market and try to buy things using only Spanish. It was a bit nerve-wracking at first, but the vendors were so kind, and they'd help me out if I got stuck.
That's the best kind of practice, real-life situations where you have to think on your feet. It forces you to use the language in a practical way.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that it's okay to not be perfect. No one speaks perfectly all the time, not even native speakers. The important thing is to keep communicating, keep trying.
Absolutely. And another thing I noticed is how helpful it is to keep a notebook or a journal. My friend started writing down new words and phrases he learned each day, and then he'd review them at night. It really helped him remember things better.
That's a great habit to have. I did something similar when I was learning Spanish. I'd write down phrases I heard in songs or in conversations, and then I'd try to use them myself the next day. It made the language feel more alive to me, more connected to my daily life.
It's all about finding what works for you, right? There's no one-size-fits-all method for learning a language. Whether it's watching shows, listening to music, practicing with friends, or keeping a journal, it's about what keeps you engaged and motivated.
Totally. And I think that's the key, staying motivated. Language learning can be a long journey, but if you enjoy the process, it doesn't feel like a chore. It becomes something you look forward to every day.
Exactly. And I think if people remember that, they'll find learning English, or any language, a lot easier and more enjoyable.
Definitely. So, for anyone listening, just remember to find what works for you, keep practicing, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's all part of the learning process.
That's so true, Sarah. And speaking of finding what works, I think it's also important to discuss setting realistic goals. I've seen so many people start learning English with all this enthusiasm, but they get discouraged when they don't see immediate progress.
Yeah, that's a big one. It's easy to fall into the trap of expecting to be fluent overnight. But learning a language is like building a muscle. It takes time and consistent effort.
Exactly. I always tell people to start small. Like, instead of aiming to speak fluently in 6 months, focus on mastering basic conversations first. Maybe set a goal to learn 5 new words a day or to have a short conversation in English each week.
That's great advice. I remember when I was learning Spanish, I set a goal to learn a certain number of words each week. But I also made sure those words were relevant to my life. For example, I'd learn words related to cooking because I love to cook. That way, I could practice using them right away.
That's smart. It makes the language feel more practical and personal. I think that's why a lot of people struggle. They're learning words and phrases that they never actually use in real life.
Exactly. If you're not going to use the word in your daily life, it's harder to remember it. That's why I always suggest people learn the language that fits their lifestyle. If you love sports, learn the terms related to that. If you're into business, focus on business English.
And don't forget to celebrate the small wins. Every time you learn a new word or successfully have a conversation in English, that's a win. It keeps you motivated to keep going.
Absolutely. It's also helpful for tracking your progress. Sometimes it feels like you're not improving, but if you look back at where you started, you'll see how far you've come.
Yeah, keeping a journal or recording yourself speaking can be really helpful. You can listen back and hear the improvements over time. It's a great way to boost your confidence.
For sure. Another thing that can help is immersing yourself in the language as much as possible. If you're surrounded by English, whether it's through media, conversations, or even just reading signs and labels, it starts to become second nature.
That's so true. While I was learning French, I made it a point to listen to French radio, read French articles, and even change the language settings on my phone to French. It was a bit challenging at first, but it helped me get used to thinking in the language.
That's a great tip. It's like tricking your brain into staying in English mode. I did something similar when I was learning Spanish. I'd switch my music playlist to all Spanish songs, and it helped me get into the flow of the language.
And speaking of music, I think it's a great way to learn without even realizing it. Have you ever caught yourself singing along to a song and suddenly realizing you understand the lyrics?
Yes, that's the best feeling. There was this one Spanish song I used to love, and I would sing it all the time. One day, I realized I actually knew what the lyrics meant, and it was such a cool moment.
That's awesome. Music has this way of making learning feel effortless. You're just enjoying the tune, and before you know it, you've picked up new vocabulary and pronunciation.
Exactly. And it's not just about learning new words. Music helps with understanding the rhythm and intonation of the language, which is just as important.
Right. And that brings me to another point. Don't forget to practice your pronunciation. It can be easy to overlook, but it's crucial for being understood.
Definitely. I used to practice by repeating phrases I heard in songs or shows. I'd mimic the way the words were said, trying to get as close as possible to the native pronunciation.
That's a great technique. And you can even record yourself and compare it to the original. It's a bit of work, but it really helps to hear how you're doing.
Absolutely. And it's also helpful to focus on one thing at a time. If you're struggling with a particular sound or word, practice just that. Don't try to do everything at once.
That's good advice. Language learning can be overwhelming, but if you break it down into smaller, manageable pieces, it becomes much more achievable.
Exactly. It's like anything else in life, really. When you're trying to achieve a big goal, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But if you take it step by step, it's not so daunting. I remember when I was learning Spanish, I'd get so frustrated because I couldn't understand everything in a conversation. But once I started focusing on just understanding the main idea instead of every single word, it became a lot easier.
That's a great point. You don't have to be perfect right away. I think a lot of people get stuck on trying to know every word, but the truth is, even native speakers don't know every word in a language. It's more about getting the gist and being able to communicate effectively.
Exactly. And it's okay to ask people to repeat themselves or to slow down. I used to be so embarrassed to do that, but I realized most people are really understanding when you're trying to learn their language. They actually appreciate the effort you're making.
Totally. I think that's something people don't realize enough. Native speakers are usually pretty patient and willing to help. They know you're learning and they respect that. I remember when I was in Quebec, trying to speak French, people were so kind. Even if I mess up, they'd help me out without making me feel bad.
That's so true. And another thing that helped me was finding a language partner. Someone who was learning English and wanted to practice with a native speaker. We'd do language exchanges, half the time in English, half the time in Spanish. It was such a good way to learn because we were both in the same boat.
That's a great idea. Having someone to practice with makes a huge difference. It's not just about learning the language, it's also about building confidence. When you're talking with someone who's learning just like you, it takes away a lot of the pressure.
Exactly. And you can make it fun too. We'd play language games, watch movies together, or even cook a meal while practicing the language. It didn't feel like studying at all.
I love that. Learning a language doesn't have to be all textbooks and grammar exercises. You can learn so much just by living life and incorporating the language into your daily activities.
For sure. And speaking of daily activities, one of the things I did was label things around my house in Spanish. It was such a simple thing, but it really helped me remember words. Every time I'd see the label, I'd repeat the word in my head, and it just stuck.
That's a great tip. It's such a practical way to learn. I've heard of people doing that with sticky notes on everything, doors, furniture, even food in the fridge. It's like turning your home into a mini language classroom.
Exactly. And it doesn't take any extra time. You're just learning as you go about your day. It's those little, consistent efforts that really add up over time.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key, consistency. Even if you only practice for 10 minutes a day, it's better than cramming for hours once a week. It keeps the language fresh in your mind.
Totally agree. It's like brushing your teeth, you wouldn't skip a day, right? The same goes for language learning. A little bit each day keeps you moving forward.
That's a great analogy, Sarah. And I think it's also important to celebrate your progress along the way. It can be easy to get caught up in what you haven't learned yet, but it's really motivating to look back and see how far you've come.
Absolutely. I used to keep a journal where I'd write down new words or phrases I learned each day. Every few weeks, I'd look back through it and realize how much I'd improved. It was a real confidence booster.
That's a fantastic idea. It's so important to recognize your achievements, no matter how small they might seem. Language learning is a journey, and every step forward is worth celebrating.
Exactly. And for anyone listening, Just remember to be kind to yourself. Learning a language is challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn.
Well said, Sarah. I think that's the perfect note to wrap up on. Thanks for sharing your insights and experiences today. I'm sure our listeners have found it really helpful.
Thanks, Mike. It's always great to chat with you. And to everyone out there, keep going. You're doing great.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. And for you guys listening to us, I just want to say before we sign off, we just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in today. If you found our conversation helpful, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps us out.
For sure, Mike. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to ENGLO Podcast and join our community of language learners. We've got plenty more tips and conversations and podcasts coming your way soon to help you on your English learning journey.
Also, drop a comment below with your favorite tip from today's episode or let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. We'd love to hear from you.
Maybe what vocabulary you guys have learned today. And finally, thanks again for watching, and remember, keep practicing, stay motivated, and most importantly, have fun with it. We'll see you in the next video.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.